If you have an intermittent start condition in your early 3rd gen Toyota pickup or 4Runner with the 22RE, you're going to want to watch this video. This is my 85 Toyota pickup. It's the last year with the solid front axle and the first year with the fuel injected 22RE. This makes it a little bit special. Special since they didn't have a lot of experience with the 22RE. They did a lot of things in the first few years that they didn't carry on afterwards. Let me show you a sample of what it's doing. When you go to start it, you don't hear a crank. All you hear is the fuel pump. This is because in the early years, the fuel pump actually turned on when you went to crank it. It didn't actually prime when you went to turn it on. So hearing the fuel pump turn on means one thing. It means that that ignition switch is working because it's sending power to the fuel pump. It's also sending power to the starter. Before I figured out what was going on, this was my best friend. I used this wire to jump the solenoid to the actual starter. Let me show you. Here's a shot of the starter. This blue wire right here, that comes from your ignition. And if you unplug it, you take your other wire, your jumper, and plug it in. Then all you need to do is go to the positive on the starter, and it starts. Here's where it differs between the early and late model pickup and 4Runners with the 22RE. The late models have a relay that's mounted right next to that finned resistor. That finned resistor is for the fuel injectors, and that's something that's also specific to early models. Since they went and put that relay in place on the later models, I thought that it probably needed it from the beginning to begin with. And so I went and added my own relay. This is what I ended up using. It's just a standard relay with a pigtail on it. Now, the black is for the ground, and the white is the switch. So the switch is the trigger that's coming from the key, and this is the ground. The yellow is constant power. So that's coming from any power source, straight from the battery. And the blue is what's normally closed. That goes out. Now, when you go and you turn on the key, it will bridge the circuit between the white and the black, which will bring the contacts together and send power between the yellow and the blue. The red wire here is not needed. I just depinned it and removed it. That's a normally open. All I'm after for is normally closed. Obviously, you don't want the starter running all the time. Then when you hit the key, this will become energized and it'll go to the starter. And here's where I mounted it. I mounted it above the starter, but below the intake manifold. On the underneath side of the intake manifold, there's two bosses there. One boss already has a number of grounds going to it. However, the second boss is threaded and it's unused in my model. So what I ended up doing is taking a long stud and I hung the relay through that boss. But because it was a long stud, it went all the way through the boss out to the other side, and that's where I ended up putting the ground. So the ground from the relay is actually on the other side of the metal boss, and it's right next to the other grounds there on the intake. So I figured it was a good spot. Now what I ended up doing is this wire right here with the corrugation on it, that actually used to go down to the starter. I just looped it back up and into the relay, no problems. I got the power from the actual starter. So down here, that's coming straight from the battery and goes to the starter. I just put another ring terminal on the starter and came up directly to the relay. So the relay is getting power from the starter. The trigger is getting it from what used to be the starter or the ignition wire. This came from the key. The ground is grounded right to the intake manifold where all the other grounds are. And I just mounted it up there. So everything's nice and short and it works like a charm. I've had this set up now for a couple weeks and no issues. Before, I would have an issue once in a while. Usually if I let the truck sit for a few days, it would go and have a no start. However, I've even had it out on the trail before where I was wheeling, shut it off for 5 minutes to go spot someone through an obstacle, come back and the truck wouldn't start. Thing is, with that jumper wire, how I showed you, it will start every single time that way. So I knew it wasn't the starter. I knew it wasn't the ignition switch because up at the ignition where the key is, the fuel pump would come on. So it led me to believe that the wiring, it's now about 40 years old. There's too much resistance in that wiring now, and it doesn't send enough power to actually trigger the solenoid on the starter. So what I did is I put a relay in. It does have enough power to go and trip that relay. The fuel pump's on a relay. So when I go and I crank, the fuel pump would come on. That's using a relay. Now the starter's using a relay as well. That 40-year-old wiring is good enough to trip a relay. It just doesn't send enough current to actually trigger the solenoid for the starter. So there we go. This is really, really simple. I had everything just lying around. That relay was just junk relay from somewhere. The pigtail, I had it lying around. If you had to buy them, probably $10. Some ring terminals, things like that. Honestly, this is one of the easiest fixes you'll ever do. You just need to decide where you're going to mount it. On the early models that didn't have the relay on the fender, that's probably a good spot to mount it where I mounted it. If you do have the relay on the fender, I would just go and mount it in exactly the same spot because all the wires are already going there. I hope you liked this video, guys. It was a short video, but it was something that was, I probably had this problem for 6 months or more, and it happened all the time. It happened when I was on the trails. It happened if the truck sat for a little bit. It even happened if I was just out running errands. So finally, I found out what it was and made the fix, and I hope that you guys can learn something from it and fix your rig if you're having an intermittent no start issue as well.